We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Dave Patterson. Now, Dave, I want to talk about how Europe is trying to deal with a newly empowered Donald Trump when it comes to negotiating the end to the Russia-Ukraine war. And it seems that Europe is trying to follow in some ways. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, when we choose between the ocean and mainland Europe, we must always head towards the ocean. We're making that choice. And I think that's kind of applicable to what's happening in Europe at the moment. They're saying, well, should we continue following the US lead, or should we carve our own path out? Which is quite ironic, seeing as almost all major decisions are made by the European Union for the nation states, the 26, I think it is, countries within the European Union. But in this regard, that they seem to be looking at casting their own path. And then, of course, this week we've seen French President Emmanuel Macron turn up at the White House. And what's your take on what was said during that bilateral meeting?
Well, I thought the meeting was cordial, and I think that there was this sense that both of these world leaders really do like each other and are very comfortable talking about really kind of sticky things, and aren't particularly embarrassed about their positions. And I thought that it was clear from particularly the exchanges that took place when they were in the Oval Office and had the press conference there. I thought that was it was far more cordial than I had anticipated. You know, that there didn't seem to be this strain that can be there oftentimes. And I thought also that the President Trump was more of what he really is in these kinds of situations than the way the media portrays him. And I think that's a good thing. He actually wants to get to an objective in the conversations. He's very transactional, as you know. I mean, and so he is always going for an end state, which is very refreshing.
It is. I'm going to play you a short clip, Dave, and I'd like you to come back and let me know what you think of that.
I'm also pleased that President Macron agrees that the cost and burden of securing the peace must be borne by the nations of Europe, not alone by the United States. And Europe must take that central role in assuring long-term security of Ukraine, which they want to do. And that's not a very big step. The big step is what's going to happen over the next few weeks.
Okay, so as you can see, that was really the bottom line up to the conversation, that Europe needs to bear more of the responsibility, the burden sharing of their own defense. Interestingly enough, almost coincidentally, President Zelensky from Ukraine offered up a proposal that there should be a Ukraine EU armed forces that would be part of a Europe security force and capability. And it sort of is starting to look like a European peacekeeping force within Ukraine, which is kind of what's on the table. So you're seeing this kind of evolutionary, as opposed to sudden, evolutionary approach to how to deal with Russia, but still you have to deal with Russia, and that's not going to happen until there is, as we've discussed, a certain amount of trust on both sides.
You know, there's long been this idea, and this was something that was front and center during the Brexit debate, about the EU wants its own army under its multi-starred flag with its anthem, answerable to the European Union Parliament. And people like Nigel Farage were told that it's a dangerous fantasy that such a thing would come to fruition. However, as we know, there already were certain elements of this in place. And it seems to me that the European Union will be massively pushing for a European coalition army that can draw troops from the member states, and then they can control it and put it on the ground. And whether that's just for a peacekeeping operation or for other things, because there's bound to be other things come up. They're like, well, we need to send a small contingent over here to do this. And it will be, I fear that what we're witnessing is the start of essentially some kind of European empire. And maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but it's got a flag, it's got an anthem, it's about to get its own army under control from which can draw troops from the member states or satraps, if you want to go Persian, on this. But I don't think that's necessarily a good thing to have a European army, whether it's in service of doing something good or not.
Well, I think, Mark, you also have to realize that there's a certain amount of gravity and mass that is associated with the current United States forces in Europe. I mean, Germany alone, we have 38,700 forces. In Europe, we have as many as 6 sites for our tactical nuclear weapons storage. And I mean, places like, Greenland, we've got 100 people who belong to the U.S. Space Force. And so there's a certain amount of presence that the United States has that will be difficult to dislodge, even if even if the United States wanted to. And so I think that is something that the Europeans are going to have to contend with as well. Yeah, and because, there's just a certain amount of value to presence, and that's what the United States has. Now, there are opportunities to do something different. Start to move forces from Europe to where the United States believes it has more of a problem, and that's in the Indo-Pacific, and that's an option. But you always have this, okay, where are you going to billet your forces? And it's clear that, and studies have been done, that bringing them back to the United States is a fairly expensive endeavor.
Yeah, I believe there's a bit of ground around Eagle Pass that could handle a few warm bodies, as it were. So we have this situation where Europe, I say Europe, I mean Europe and the European Union together in this particular setting, is becoming more focused inwards for what it needs to do to combat the Russian aggression. And they seem to be cutting America out because they don't like Donald Trump's strategy. But it has been the European strategy that has been dominant for the last 3 years. And the war is no closer to ending by following that strategy. And then Trump comes in with his new strategy, and they're blocking themselves off and going turtle, I think is the phrase, for their original strategy that has been that is so far 3 years down the line proven not to have made any difference whatsoever. Dave, final word for you. Whose strategy do you think will prevail ultimately?
I think Donald Trump's strategy. I think Donald Trump's approach. The Trump strategy is more of a Trump doctrine that has to that takes in much more than just Europe. And so when you talk about the United States, you have to talk about the larger picture, and that was very well laid out by Hegseth when he was in NATO. First and foremost, the domestic problems at the border, that needs to be solved. Indo-Pacific and China next, and then Europe. And I would offer that the United States has much more in terms of its outreach to our southern neighbors than we've had in the past, and that's important. So it's really a global doctrine that Trump is putting forward, and I think that's what's you have to look at when you can't just look at individual Europe versus Indo-Pacific versus our border. You have to look at the whole thing.
So won't people worry that that's creeping elements of globalism, or do they not mind because it would be America at the head of that? Is it?
No, globalism is when you're happy to suborn your country's interests to those of the greater group. That is not what's happening with Trump. We have to look at these things because the United States lives in the world, but not of it. And we do have issues that must be resolved, that must be addressed. But that doesn't mean that we're going to suborn the interests of the United States to any of those regions.
Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much.
Happy to be with you, Mark, always.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, Scott Cosenza and Dave Patterson. Thank you for joining us. And of course, thanks to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time each week to tune in. You are appreciated. Please do remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.